Hi, good morning. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for attending today's Tariff Update, Tariff Trends webinar. My name is Marcus Eeman. I'm a Director of Customs here at Flexport. And so we have a lot of content to cover here. So I just want to go over a few kind of housekeeping notes before we begin. On your screen, you'll see a sidebar to the right of the main stage where you can submit questions. At the end of the presentation, we host a Q&A and answer audience questions. So be sure to get your questions in early. We do try to prioritize by when the question gets in. In that same sidebar, you'll see a tab labeled Docs. This is where you can download a copy of today's slides and find some other helpful resources. Above your screen, you also have a button to request a duty drawback analysis from Flexport. Duty drawback, how you get money back from the government. This is something, if you're not part of it or you haven't kicked the wheels on it, please take a look at it. We feel very proud of our program, and we'll review this a little bit further on in the presentation. But click that button if you want Flexport to reach out to discuss a drawback analysis for your business. Okay, and now before we begin, just a quick legal note here. Please keep in mind that all this information provided in the session is based on the situation at this current time and may not be customized to your specific business requirements. We will always recommend reaching out to a Flexport expert to discuss your particular situation. Today's a little bit different for Tariff Trends. I don't have another customs person with me here, but I actually have Kyle Beaulieu joining me. He's our head of Ocean for the Americas for Flexport. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Section 301 and all the shipbuilding tariffs here as a different portion, a different perspective maybe on some of these tariffs that we've gone over many times in these last few months. The agenda for today is that we're going to go through some of the latest news. We're going to look at the Section 232 medium and heavy vehicle duty announcement that's going into effect on November 1st, because there's a few things to unpack there. You may think, oh, well, this isn't maybe meant for me. Well, it might be. We're going to get into that. We're also going to look at the Section 301 shipbuilding that I mentioned. Kyle's going to dive into that, and then we're just going to have a Q&A to wrap up. So with that, the latest news is kind of, I think, maybe 5 buckets. I think really starting recently here, we see Colombia being threatened with additional tariffs. There are some Truth Social posts here. The president has been, confirmed that he's considering that tariffs are under consideration based on uncooperative attitudes with the Trump administration. Currently, they have an IEEPA reciprocal rate of 10%. They don't have a specific rate yet. So this may potentially change. That's something that we're watching very closely, especially as a coffee drinker, knowing that there's already pretty heavy tariffs on 50% tariffs on Brazilian coffee. Please don't hit Colombia too hard. I'm addicted. As for Nicaragua, there was a Section 301 investigation that maybe some people didn't realize. It actually started, I think it was just about a month or so before Biden left. This initiated under the Biden White House, but it's been continuing. They prepared a 48-page report here under Section 301, and they found violations in Nicaragua having to do with human rights, having to do with unfair business practices, having to do with cheating. Remember, Section 301 is looking for unfair business conditions in terms of trade, or other kinds of advantages, disadvantages given to American companies, or other unfair advantages given to Nicaraguan companies. And so they found quite a few of these violations here, both that and also human rights and child labor abuses, and undue pressure on religious institutions as well. As part of that report, the U.S. Trade Representative recommended suspending the CAFTA status for Nicaragua. Remember, Nicaragua is part of a free trade agreement called DR-CAFTA. They get duty-free treatment. There's a lot of apparel manufacturing that happens there, textile manufacturing. They want a suspension of their entry in that program for 12 months. They also recommended a 100% tariff under Section 301. This is different than all the IEEPA tariffs here. This is a Section 301 investigation. So that's something else to watch closely. A couple of weeks ago, actually just last week, there was a Section 232 duties levied on timber and lumber, but also including timber and lumber derivatives, that is furniture. And so starting on October 14th, there's a 10% Section 232 duties on timber and lumber, 25% on select wooden furniture, mostly focused on vanities, as kitchen vanities, as well as upholstered furniture. And so right now those are at 25%. But the announcement also said that as of January 1st, upholstered furniture is going to go up to 30%. and the vanities are going to rise to 50%. So we're going to see more Section 232 duties there as well. This is also different than maybe some of the other material-based ones in that there's no like kind of lumber breakout. Like you don't just avoid pay only 10% on or 25% on the value of the timber. You pay 25% on the whole value of the product. Fourth, 2 weeks from now is the oral arguments for the Voss Selections v. Trump Supreme Court case. This is the case that challenges 5 of the IEEPA provisions. So that is the Canadian, Mexican, and Chinese fentanyl tariffs, as well as 2 rounds of reciprocal IEEPA tariffs. This is challenging that, saying IEEPA, the act itself, doesn't actually allow the president to levy tariffs. So says the challengers. The government says, yes, it does. And from what we're hearing and from what we can see so far, the decision seems a little bit murky. It doesn't seem like it's going to clearly go either way. Obviously, the president lost on the first 2 courts, at the CIT and then at the Circuit Appeals Court. But we're recommending kind of to our clients, look at your options here, but it seems like protest may be the best hedge. A protest kind of keeps your entry open and active while this case proceeds. We're not exactly sure what's going to happen. Are we going to have a decision a few weeks afterward, or are they going to wait until like kind of the June decision dump, of 2026? We're not sure, but if you haven't yet, consider filing protests as like a way to kind of keep it open. It really depends on how the Supreme Court writes their opinion. They could write it very broadly, very simply, like you must return all the money back, or it says importers may challenge to get their money back under this statute. We're not quite sure what exactly the Supreme Court will decide, but a protest hedges your bets. Excuse me. But I think another portion that I think is good to know about this is that even if the case is won, right? The IEEPA is declared illegal, refunds are authorized. The Supreme Court says in some form or fashion, hey, government, give money back. There's a lot of time that can happen, a lot of hijinks that can happen between the time when the Supreme Court says, hey, these tariffs are illegal, to actually having money come back into your bank account. So I think just to kind of set expectations here, I would think that we were maybe a longer refund process. This may not be something that goes quickly. This may be something that drags on. Maybe it's a protest. Maybe they require court challenges. Maybe they require large amounts of evidence. Maybe it comes along with audits. I don't know, but I'm not expecting to be a very simple process, even though it could be. I think that we should all expect a longer process when it comes to actually getting money back, even if the court finds in favor of Voss selections. Finally, this is I try to keep it more toward like what's the actual news, but I feel like this rumor is too important to leave off the slide. You may remember a couple of weeks ago, Trump threatened to say there's going to be 100% tariff on China on a Friday night, because it's always on a Friday night, and he threatened 100% starting November 1st. Then a few days later on Sunday night, he's like, oh, maybe we have we've got a better relationship with Xi. They're going to back off their export controls here. Now we don't need to do this. And it seemed like it was not, just bluster or threat, or maybe even a misunderstanding. But now, as of yesterday, he said in a press conference, on Monday, he said in a press conference, 100% is still on the table for November 1st if we can't get a deal done in Korea. So that's fascinating to watch. That is definitely something that maybe it could still be there. How does that 100% come? Is that going to be part of the reciprocal? Is that going to be something else? Is that Section 301? We're not quite sure, but we'll have to see. Seems like it's just a threat, but who knows at this point. And additionally, we're also getting close to the end of the second 90-day pause. Remember, back on Liberation Day, China had the 34% tariff. They, retaliated. Is 84%, is 125%. And then in May, Trump said, okay, we're going to pause a little bit. We're going to do a 90-day pause to give us a window to negotiate. And so we're just going to give them the all-country 10% rate on China while we negotiate for 90 days. The 90 days came and went. They reauthorized another 90-day pause in August. And so we're now coming to the end of that second 90-day pause in August, meaning on November 10th, the rates could go back up to the 34% on reciprocal, so otherwise a total of 54% on all Chinese imports. So yeah, 34% reciprocal plus 20% IEEPA fentanyl. That gets us to 54%. So we're going to watch to see what happens there. It's a couple weeks out, but if you have air shipments and you have shipments that you want to move by air to maybe hedge your bets, this is maybe the last call to potentially book that if you think the discussions are not going to be productive. Okay, so that's the headlines around here, but we're going to focus mainly on the Section 232 order for medium and heavy duty vehicles, MHDV, because that's a mouthful to say, the MHDV order here, because there's a few pieces that go into it. And I'm going to pause on this for just a minute, one to have a sip of coffee, but also to have you just take a look at all the active Section 232 investigations going on. We are working our way through the list. They keep adding new ones to the bottom. If they add any more, I can't do this all on one slide. But hopefully this is the end of it here. We are currently right in the middle on the medium heavy duty trucks and parts. It was 193 days from when they announced this to when tariffs were implemented. Now remember, for 232, the law says that if they're going to do this investigation, they have to conclude that investigation in 270 days with recommendations. So we're seeing both on the ones that were kind of initiated this year, like copper and timber and the medium heavy MHDVs, we are seeing well under the 270 days. There are two others that are still under the 270 days, but are maybe larger impact, pharmaceuticals and semiconductors. But we're going to look at the MHDT here and see what we got. So medium heavy duty vehicles. Starts November 1st, buses 10%, medium and heavy duty trucks 25%, and then parts of any of those 25%. The tariff stacking is equivalent to auto parts on Section 232. So if you're in the automotive industry or you do parts or OEMs or anything like that, aftermarket, you'll know that the 25% it kind of gets applied first. The first question in this flow chart is, well, okay, does the 25% on auto parts apply? If yes, that's what you pay. If not, look at some of the other flag tariffs, whether it's IEEPA or Section 232 on steel or aluminum. The tariff preference is equivalent here. So these ones are going to be kind of at the same level. So if you have an auto part that's flagged, auto parts have an exclusion, or rather an option to disclaim it, if it's not part of a passenger vehicle or light truck. Many times, especially now, we've seen some of our importers saying, no, it doesn't apply because this is an auto part for a heavy truck. This is, for a semi-trailer, for a semi-tractor. This is going to kind of put it on equivalent footing. So you still will review this one before going on to other Section 232 or other IEEPA applicability. But the short version is that if this is an auto part of medium heavy duty vehicles, then Section 232, steel, copper, aluminum would not apply. And this also doesn't double stack. So if you have something that's applicable as maybe it is for both passenger vehicle and light truck, and it's also for heavy duty and light truck, we can come back to that in a second. In that case, they don't stack on top of each other. You don't do 25% plus 25%. It's going to be either one. Third is that there's no breakout on parts, but there is a breakout for U.S. content on completed vehicles. The Secretary of Commerce has been authorized to give case-by-case relief for completed vehicles under USMCA. And automakers have to request this status. So I don't think, maybe there's a handful of large automakers on this call, but I think for most importers, this isn't going to be readily applicable. You're not importing completed cars. However, there is something that I do think has a sneaky applicability, and this is when we look at our silver lining. So there's a little bit of some good news here in this otherwise dark storm cloud. First, they provided this provision, the 9903-7409 provision, which is for products that are not classified in Chapter 72, 73, 76, not on an auto parts 232 list, but are going to be used in the production of a medium or heavy duty vehicle. In this case, importers can opt in to paying 25% Section 232. Now, why would somebody want to pay Section 232 on one of these parts? Well, Maybe 25% is less than 50% on a steel or aluminum flag tariff. Maybe 25% is less than your IEEPA rate. We think about Brazil, India, Switzerland, Burma, Myanmar. These are some countries that have high IEEPA reciprocal rates, right? Brazil and India are both at 50%. Maybe it's more advantageous to say this is for a vehicle part or for vehicle production rather than paying the IEEPA rate. The hypothetical scenario, we kind of have two here. Imagine, bringing in automotive paint. Well, this is for the production of a, heavy-duty vehicle. If it's Brazilian origin, you pay 50%. But if it's going to be used in production of a vehicle, you can claim this, 232. You can opt into paying 232 duties instead and only pay 25%. Say another example, India exports a lot of leather hides, right? If you're an importer of leather hides from India, right now you pay 50% IEEPA reciprocal. That's the 25% India plus the 25% Russian oil, makes 50%. But if you are going to certify that that leather is going to be used in production of a vehicle or medium or heavy duty vehicle, you can claim this exemption instead. Well, maybe I don't call it an exemption. You can use this alternative instead of 7409 to only pay 25% on that import of leather hides. So the other one that it kind of gets lost in the shuffle here is that this also is going to apply to the passenger vehicles and light trucks starting on November 1st. They have a different code. So there's the 9903-7409 for medium heavy duty vehicles. But they added an additional code, 9903-9407, just reordering the numbers, 9407, that is for passenger vehicles and light trucks. So importing leather items of that is going to be part of it. Now, major caveat, these parts, these kinds of inputs, so things like plastics, things like rubber that aren't otherwise covered, maybe instruments of Chapter 90, 82, 83, zinc articles, nickel articles, other earth minerals used in this, maybe ceramics are used in this here. There's quite a bit of possibility. I already mentioned paints and leather, right? These are some possibilities. There are some chapters that aren't part of these provisions that could still be used in it. If you want to, you can opt in to one of these Section 232s. However, the main condition is that it has to be used in the production of one of these kinds of vehicles. So I would highly, highly recommend that you have affidavits completed, that you have production records about how this is going to be used after the fact. So if you're going to say that, yes, I'm going to pay this 25%, it has to be used in vehicle production. If it's not used in vehicle production, you can't opt into this. Remember, the incentive of these Section 232s is to encourage more manufacturing in the US for autos and auto parts. So if you're not doing that, you don't get to use this possible savings opportunity. Okay, second good news here is that Great Britain, EU, Japan deals are looking better with age. Great Britain has a 10% cap on the cost of their auto parts. EU and Japan have a 15%. So instead of a 25% on auto parts, they are capped out at 15%. That's 15% combined between the standard and most favored nation rate, the normal duty rate, and Section 232 combining to lead to a 15% cap or 10% in the case of Great Britain. So that is a notable savings opportunity there. A lot of our Japanese and EU automakers will notice and realize some savings here, or at least less pain through this provision. And finally, USMCA is still looking good for parts for these medium and heavy duty vehicles. Remember, USMCA auto parts have an exclusion for passenger vehicles and light trucks. Heavy trucks also have an exclusion too. If the parts are USMCA qualifying, parts are exempt from the Section 232 duties on medium heavy duty vehicles, just like they are in passenger vehicles, in addition to base duties. So once again, USMCA is still somewhat of like the best free trade agreement left out there, in that it still does provide true savings opportunities for our customers. Okay. With that, I'm going to pause here and turn it over to Kyle to talk about Section 301, but not Section 301 with China or Section 301 with Nicaragua, Section 301 with shipbuilding, specifically within China. So Kyle, why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Thank you, Marcus. Yeah, so today we're going to talk about 301 for shipbuilding. I think first, just a quick review here of what Section 301 is and how this applies to shipbuilding. So this is a tool that in the U.S. law that gives the U.S. trade representative the authority to investigate or take action against a foreign country's unfair trade practices. So actually under the Biden administration, in April 2024, a petition was filed by some major U.S. labor unions that started an investigation into China's maritime, logistics, and shipbuilding sectors to assess whether or not they did have unfair trade practices. And as a result of that investigation, in January 2025, an official report was released that found that China's trade practices were unfair and have had a negative impact in U.S. commerce due to the state-led practices and rapid growth in the shipbuilding sector. So to put this into perspective of the market share they've taken over the last 25 years. So in 1999, China's shipbuilding market represented less than 5% of global tonnage, and that is now over 50% in 2023. And over that time as well, China's ownership of the commercial world fleet has risen to over 19% as of January 2024. And they control production over 70% of ship-to-shore cranes, 80%, 6% of intermodal chassis, and 95% of shipping containers. So it's been a massive change in the landscape for building each of these necessary and needed products for shipbuilding and ship operations over the last 25 years. And to give you a perspective now, the current order book for new vessels has around 75% of those vessels being built in China. And so a lot of those orders were placed before this latest investigation and the resulting tariff. So after the proposal and review session in April, U.S. port fees and tariffs were announced that went into effect in October. Those went into effect last week on October 14th. And the fees and tariffs are directed across the sector at Chinese-built, owned, or flagged vessels, plus Chinese-made port equipment. So in the next slide here, we're going to look at what are those fees, how do they play out. So this is a summary of those different charges. So you can see here across, there's some variants. Annex 1 is on Chinese-owned or operated vessels, while Annex 2 is on Chinese-built vessels. And between these two, it's the higher of the two costs, depending on the carrier and how it applies. The most substantial one of these, and the first one that you can see, is on Chinese-owned or operated vessels. So that comes in at $50 per net ton. And what that translates to for you, for all you in the shipping containers, is to about $300 per TEU or $600 per 40 high cube. So quite substantial overall. And that fee increases annually up to $140 per net ton by 2028. And so the impact of this is very clearly on COSCO and WCL, who are Chinese-owned or from Hong Kong. And so they cannot necessarily manage around these charges like other carriers can. So Reuters has cited that it's expected that the China-owned COSCO is the most affected and will account for nearly half of the over $2 billion costs from these fees in 2026. So other carriers really mainly fall under this Annex 2. And so they're subject to about 35% of that fee, which translates to about $100 per TEU when they operate Chinese-built vessels. The difference for them, which we'll talk a little bit here in a couple slides about, is that they do have the ability often to swap out those vessels to other trades. And because they had notice of time, they've already actually done quite a bit of that. For each of these vessel fees, carriers must self-report and pay before arrival, or they face rejection or holding at a U.S. port, which is definitely potentially an operational concern if they weren't to do that. There's a few important things to note that aren't necessarily accounted for here on this slide, but they are not called, or they are not charged, I should say, for every port call or rotation. So they apply on the first port of call on a string. So, for example, on the U.S. East Coast, it's not uncommon for carriers to call ports up and down the U.S. East Coast. So they can go from New York to Norfolk to Savannah and Charleston. They don't they won't be charged 4 times in this instance. They'll be charged once at the first port of call. And this is important detail because it's potentially could incentivize carriers to increase the number of port calls in the US. Especially right now, it's not uncommon for vessels to either the PSW to only call LA or Long Beach, or the PNW to only call Seattle or Tacoma. So there's potential that carriers, as they go into next year and they reconsider their routings, could take this into consideration for the number of calls that they make in the US on those strings. Balancing this out, though, and which is potentially beneficial for US West Coast routings, there's also a cap on the number of times that an individual vessel can be charged in a year. So this is capped at 5. After that, that vessel will no longer be charged. So each of these nuances really gives carriers additional things to consider when trying to plan for supply and demand. So it's not uncommon, right, for a carrier to transition a new vessel on a string when a vessel has to undergo repairs, or when a vessel is delayed at another port and it's got off schedule and they need to implement another one. These moves are generally just weighed against short-term cost benefit for the carrier and what kind of vessels do they have in their fleet. But now this additional cost could be taken into consideration, because if you put in a vessel for only one call, that's an expensive additional hit to your bottom line. And as for the cranes and chassis, the basis for these charges are really in a multi-administration effort towards improving security at key infrastructure in the US, like US ports, to not have them as reliant on US production or technology. The largest impact here will be on the ship-to-shore cranes. So they represent over 70% of the market. And these overall tariffs could increase the cost of port modernization and expansion within the US. Okay, so that's the summary of the US. Next, we're going to look at China's response to this. And so China kind of sat on this for a little while, and just this month, after the return from Golden Week, have made the response. When in doubt, what you have to think for the China's response is, what did the US do? So it's essentially a mirror of what Section 301, the shipbuilding charges, are. So it targets the opposite. So it targets US owned, US operator, US built, or US flagged vessels. It also launched on October 14th. So carriers did not have time to necessarily respond to it. And it escalates on the exact same dates through 2028 as the other US fees. And the fees are similar. So they start around 400 RMB, which translates to about $56 per net ton, versus the $50 per net ton that came from the Section 301 fee. So this is very, very similar to the US, and it's basically a mirroring of the response. Now, the impact here is much smaller, but it is clear. So it's a much smaller percentage of global cargo fleet. And on the TPEB, this can impact Matson, the CMA, APL, US Flag Services, and the Gemini Cooperation. They all have to manage around these fees. But overall, it's a much smaller portion. So for example, the US built vessels are less than 1% of current global order book, versus over 75% from China. Now, what does all this mean for importers? So this is definitely increasing the cost of carriers. So we talked about the highest cost there being about $300 per TEU. What non-Chinese flag carriers have done, so since the announcement of this, they've started redeploying vessels across the trades, and they have made the determination that they will not charge an additional fee on any US-bound cargo. So that's a good news for importers there. And really, they've managed to heavily mitigate the impact of this charge by sending those vessels to other trades and putting new ones in their place. Now, the Chinese flag carriers, COSCO and OOCL, they've also determined that they will not charge a fee, but they have not been able to fully redeploy. So they take a pretty significant hit there. I mentioned earlier the total expected cost to COSCO. And so right now, and now this is just current deployment on the TPEB, There's currently 6 carriers with Chinese or Hong Kong flagged vessels still on the TPEB, and 10% of those vessels, that represents 10% of total vessels and about 12% of total TEU on TPEB. Now, of those 61 vessels, COSCO and OOCL account for 50 of them. So clearly, the impact to them is much larger. That represents, those vessels represent over 70%, over 90% of their fleets, respectively. Outside of them, Maersk actually has the highest number of vessels, but it's a small percentage of their overall fleet, and something that they'll likely be able to further mitigate the cost of. Now, initially, when this was announced, there was expected that there'd be a new surcharge implemented with it, but because those 9 Chinese flag carriers have been able to redeploy, they've made a determination that they will not charge right now. But it's important to note that they should expect over the course of the next few years, potentially a new surcharge related to these. So even if they're not calling the U.S., there's an inherent cost to carriers by not being able to actively use their fleet across the global network. And all carriers and all MVOs have retained the right to charge a fee if they determine it's necessary to do so. If they do that, it will need to be announced 30 days prior to implementation. Now, as for the carrier response to the special port fee, as I noted, this just really came out in October. So impacted carriers are currently determining all their redeployment options, and they may have to work around any commitments that they might have to the U.S. government for U.S. flag services. The most immediate impact is, or seen impact or change, was Hapag and Maersk and the WC5 actually have rerouted multiple vessels already. So they stopped their port of call in China for that service and rerouted via other shuttle services. Matson also announced that despite the impact to them on the cost structure, that they will not charge a fee at this time, and overall that they're committed to the trade. So in summary, a lot of different charges out there that carriers have to navigate around, but so far today they've been able to navigate them. And it's not coming necessarily as an increased cost to importers as a surcharge, but it's something that we should consider and expect in the future. So with that, I'll bring Marcus back on, and we'll go to Q&A.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Kyle. I think we actually have just a couple of one other slide here just to kind of plug some things here about how else we can kind of help support. I mentioned at the beginning here the drawback analysis, and please feel free to add request this if this is something you need using the button at the top of the screen. If you have annual drawback already, we feel very confident in a lot of the tooling that we've been rolling out in our drawback program this year. We're finding a lot more money for people that are already using this. So if you're already having this and your drawback claims exceed $1 million of refunds, we want to go head to head and see what we can do. See if we can find you more money. We think we can. On average, we're finding some of our customers more than 2 times what other drawback providers are finding for them. Not because like we're we're doing anything, mostly because we're trying to find better places to find that data and link together those imports and those exports. There's no new kind of data obligation here. There's no obligation to kind of reporting things, but we feel very confident in this. So if you have it, feel free to see if we can get you more. We also still offer our Flexport customs analysis using your very own ACE data. You can look for this. Just go ahead and click yes in the poll, and you can see it. And of course, many of you already know about our tariff simulator. We've done this a few times. I even see some of the questions came in asking about the tariff simulator. We'll go into that. If you haven't looked at it yet, please check it out. tariffs@flexport.com. We're hoping to make this very easy for our importers to understand, and we only update based off of official guidance here. So with that, we will go into our Q&A, and we have quite a few. So we'll go kind of quickly into a few of these to start. Let's see here. So the first one, please clarify further on the violations found by USTR with Nicaragua. Is this only against Nicaragua? Yes, it is only against Nicaragua. These are 301 investigations are very specific. to countries. They found this based on kind of a mixture of human rights violations. There's some child labor. There's one report saying that there's about 10 to 14-year-old kids who are working in gold mining operations in Nicaragua. Questions about seizing company assets without provocation, weird user fees and other kind of administrative penalties, in addition to kind of messing with Jesuit services, Catholic services as well. So that's really was kind of the crux of it. Was mostly focused on human rights violations as well as unfair trade practices. But yes, it is only focused on Nicaragua. Somebody asked about the protest. You only need to protest if the claim is going to be liquidated, which happens almost a year after entry. So very few companies will have entries that are approaching liquidation since the tariffs didn't start until April of this year, correct? Well, the IEEPA reciprocal tariffs didn't start until April of this year, but for many, this may have started back in February when Canada, Mexico, and China, which, by the way, are at the subject of the Supreme Court case, started to see tariffs starting in February, later then again in March. They started to get impacted by these tariffs. And you're correct, it does take about 314 days from the date of customs release until an entry liquidates. However, that means we're starting to come to this point here in about a month. So the reason I'm bringing it up is to have a plan for yourself and make sure you realize this, that like, hey, these are coming up. You need to find out, what's your plan? Are you going to kind of take a chance here? Do you want to file a protest to keep them open? What's kind of your approach? What's kind of your view? And remember, liquidation happens whenever CBP usually just reviews an entry. So whether it's a CF28, if you ever filed a PSC, most of those will go to accelerated liquidation, moving up your liquidation date. But also, liquidation is kind of a file close. It's sort of like when CBP reviews it, everything looks right, and they close the folder and put it in the stack, saying like, we reviewed it, they're done. So if they're doing entry reviews, even if they're not issuing CF28s, some of your entries may just be liquidating early because CBP has been beefing up their reviews and their audit team. So you may be seeing more of this. So maybe the bulk of your entries haven't liquidated yet. Maybe that's coming in a month or 2 months. But what you may be seeing, though, is here and there, CBP is reviewing very closely some of these. They are doing a file close, they're liquidating it. You don't actually even know about it because it's all happening behind the scenes. This is where there's a real value to this kind of Flexport customs ACE analysis where you can see this happening in real time. Let's see. Should we pause? Oh, here's kind of a one for both of us, Kyle. Should we pause our freight due to the pending 100% 11/1 China tariffs, or try to ship as much as possible prior to the 90-day pause that ends on 11/10? I guess, Kyle, first question: 11/1's kind of close for ocean freight from China. Do they have a leg to stand on here? Is there a very fast boat service that can get it from China to the U.S. West Coast before November 1st?
There's not. And even if you want to go aim for a departure before each of these dates, you really want to make a booking now. So there's a very small chance you could get in on a departure before 11/1, but a better chance before that pause of the 90-day tariff change. Do you want to remind our listeners too on how that plays out between arrivals and departures?
Yeah, so if there's like what they call like an in-transit provision, like there was with the IEEPA reciprocal tariffs, it had to be departed before a certain date and then, entered into the US at a certain date. And generally, there's kind of some complexity, which I'm going to just, gleefully hop over here. Generally, it should be based on arrival. So get it to the US before those deadline dates will put you in a good spot. I'm not going to guarantee anything because a lot of things can happen. Vessel changes, ITs, ports of arrival, holds, exams, all of these things can come into play of where, what actually is your date of entry, but for tariff calculation purposes. However, if you get it arrive to the US before the effective date, you're putting yourself in the best position to realize any possible savings that may occur.
Yeah, and with that, on arrivals, if really that's what you're targeting, there's very few options that are left before either of these dates. And the options you do have are really from mainland China and a couple of the fast boat services. So if you've moved to other regions, then that won't really apply. But these are China based, so those options are from China-based ports. One thing I'll add here too, what we've seen in talking to a lot of different importers is a lot of importers have taken to managing their supply chain just within their needs because it has become very difficult to plan and coordinate around these different dates. So though they have tried maybe with a little bit of their cargo to give themselves some insurance on these different tariffs, because the landscape has changed so frequently, quite a few of them have focused more on what is their total need for cargo at this time and how do they balance out their own inventory needs. Next question I'll take, have any surcharges been announced that have been passed on to importers related to the 301 on Chinese built vessels? No surcharges at this time from any carriers. So if you see a surcharge out there from an MVO, it is not coming from carriers. And then also an additional question on the vessels is if Chinese carrier ships will not initially charge a fee to importers in response to Section 301, are they just absorbing all the cost for now? That is correct. So they are absorbing those costs for now, and it's a pretty substantial hit to their bottom line, especially for Costco and WCL. But this is an area where you have to take overall market considerations into effect. So because other carriers are not charging that fee, it'd be pretty difficult for Costco or WCL to charge their own fee separately. Could they do it? Yes, but it would put them at a disadvantage versus the overall market. And lastly, there was a question too on the number of times a vessel can be charged. So that is capped at 5 times per year, not total. So 5 times per year at the beginning of every year, it refreshes. Marcus, go back to you for.
Yeah, looks like I got another batch here. Question regarding January 1st, 2026 updates on timber furniture 232. Will those only be applicable for products that include wood? For example, if you have a metal chair that doesn't contain wood under an HTS in the order, would the product be exempt? So first of all, 2 things here. Number 1 is that the HTSs in the order are very focused on wooden frames. So just kind of a note there here. But if say they were to expand it, for instance, I would caution you about this because there are still tariffs on steel and aluminum, and some of those Section 232 on steel and aluminum are mentioning furniture HTS as well. So you may be out of the frying pan into the fire. You may be avoiding the 25% or 30% wood tariff, but you happen to fall into the 50% tariff on furniture based on the steel or metal or aluminum content. So something to kind of keep in mind there is that you may be exempt here, but you may not be out of the woods, pun intended. If the trade truce is not extended, would the tariffs increase to 150%? That was the final level before the truce was announced, plus the new 100% that was threatened recently. I'm going to set aside the 100% threat that came on Truth Social that seemed to be backtracked, that was then said again on Monday. I'm going to ignore that first part and say, okay, well, Marcus, what happens on November 10th? Why did you say 54%? It was 145% when the truce went into effect. I'm basing this off of a very literal reading of the HTS. And so China has their own specific code of an IEEPA reciprocal rate. I think it's 99030163 or 68, and that says specifically 34%. It also says in the notes this tariff, this specific code is suspended until November 10th. The implementation is suspended. So my reading of that is like once this date passes, what goes into effect is what's written in the HTS, and what's written in the HTS says 34%. So that's why I'm thinking it's going to go back to 34%. Now, I will be prepared to be humbled by a president with a different mind than me, but me reading the tariff very plainly, very clearly, I read this as saying if the suspension were to end and this goes into effect, what will go into effect is what is written in the HTS, and what is written says 34%, not 125%. Okay. Let's see. Do you feel that the potential 34% reciprocal for China will be based on arrival to the U.S., sailing date from China, or sailing from the last foreign port? My guess is a rival, but it's a very thin guess. The reason why is I think there's been so much kind of like, this is known, this has been happening for a while. This has been kind of a long running thing. This is a suspension of something that should already be implemented. So I would say of those three options, I'm leaning slightly toward a very quick implementation, meaning it'll just be in effect on November 10th, no delays, no questions, but that is just an opinion. I am basing that off of nothing except my own intuition. Let's see here. Kyle, do you anticipate increased TPEB transit times with carriers avoiding sending U.S. flag ships to China and avoiding sending Chinese ships to the U.S.? Will they change vessels more at intermediate ports?
Yeah, no, this is a good question. You could see some increased transit times. I think would be limited. What you have today is because huge portion of the U.S. charges go to Costco and WCL, they still have to stay competitive on their main strings. So I think probably options there are limited. But with the latest movement on the WC5 and sort of rotating in and out vessels, at least for the short term, the vessels that were, or the cargo that was going back to China did see increased transit time. So there could be some adjustments there. And what I'd call out for this is on TPEB, carriers reset their network every year. And generally those announcements are made in January or February. So if there is increased transit times or changes that they anticipate for the long term, that's when we'll see the announcements for those changes.
Okay. I think we have two more here, and then we're going to wrap up, so I'll answer these last two. Are there any estimates on when the Supreme Court could issue their ruling on the IEEPA tariffs? No. The Supreme Court they kind of do their own thing. They like to take their time sometimes. The thing that maybe suggests it could be an earlier decision is that they moved really quickly to get this to the Supreme Court. This was just challenged about 7 months ago, is when I think it was 7 or 8 months ago when the Voss selections, the first case was brought to the CIT. They heard it, they listened to the arguments, and then it went again to the appeals court, and then it went again to the Supreme Court. All that happened pretty quickly. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. So if that is any kind of indicator, I would maybe lean toward maybe the Supreme Court does issue a ruling a little bit sooner, but this is just kind of me trying to read some of the Supreme Court tea leaves about how quickly they're going to issue it. It could be fast. They can issue it earlier if they want to, but it also is really typical to kind of see a lot of these decisions come out near the end of term, which happens in kind of May, June, July areas when a lot of those kind of decisions, even if they've heard, they listened to the oral arguments months before, it could take them a while to actually issue their decision. So I think maybe a little earlier, but it wouldn't be surprising if they waited until June or July to issue their ruling on this. And then last one before we get the hook here, please elaborate further on the semiconductor tariff. And what are we expecting? This is a terrible note to leave on, but I will try to say this. This is the section of all those 13 Section 232 investigations. This is the one that I think is most concerning for me. The semiconductors and manufacturing equipment is okay. The thyristors, the transistors, all the chips, all the GPUs, the hard drives, all that sort of stuff is part of it. But it's for semiconductors, semiconductor manufacturing, and semiconductor derivatives, which, based on some of the comments from the administration, could be anything with semiconductors. So if you have a margarita machine with a touchscreen, that is where I suddenly get very concerned. All the Internet of Things, all the things that have a slight little, computer function. It doesn't really do much other than connect to your phone or has a touch screen, or you can program it easier. Are those going to be brought into scope? I'm not sure. But the threat was 100%. Seemed to back off on this. In addition to, I don't know if this is going to include phones. I don't know if this is going to include laptops here. But the possibility that this spreads out to anything containing semiconductors, or computer chipsets, is possible. That was kind of clarified in the initial discussions of the scope of this investigation, is that all of these semiconductor derivatives could be very expansive and potentially at a very high duty rate. And so if it's been difficult for you to try to sort out, well, what's the value of my aluminum spring in my plastic cosmetic piston pump? Well, now it's going to get a lot harder. What is the value of like the computer chipset, and where was that chipset made potentially could even come into play. This is one that I think could get very messy very fast, and that's one that I'm very, very concerned about, watching very closely of all the ongoing Section 232. Nothing's been announced. Trump threatened a 100% tariff a couple months ago. Nothing happened since then, but it's the one I'm watching closely. So I hope you're all scared with me. But in any case, that will conclude today's webinar. On that note, thank you everyone for attending. We'll email a link with the recording tomorrow, and everybody else have a great day. We'll see you next time.